Okay, so we can start. How is everybody doing? I hope you're good. Now we last week we finished chapter 10, and this week we're starting chapter 11, 2 Samuel chapter 11. And before I start, I just want to summarize the very end of last week's class, because it's very important to keep in mind as we start chapter 11. So what we saw throughout the last couple chapters, we saw David really acting, despite being faced with wars and despite being faced with all kinds of complicated situations, really going out of his way to, on the one hand, act in fairness, justice, and to pursue justice whenever possible. But at the same time, he knew how to act decisively against enemies, and it didn't confuse him. In other words, on the one hand, yes, he was a man who sought to do the right thing and to seek justice and to do good for people that he want, that deserved good, that were good people, that did him a good turn. Okay. On the other hand, when he was dealing with an enemy, he was never afraid to be decisive. And we saw also in chapter 10, verse 19, we saw that as a result of these various wars that he managed and that he fought, we're talking in this case about the wars against the various Aramite peoples, nations. And it says here that when all these kings saw that all of them had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. And so I found this would also be a very interesting comment on what some of the things we're dealing with today. And I mentioned that as well, the importance of deterrence, and that ultimately what brings you to peace. But the most important thing, though, again, was this idea of David had a very good sense of balance. On the one hand, he pursued justice. On the other hand, he knew to be tough with his enemies. And then, of course, I alluded to the fact that starting in chapter 11, it all falls apart. And it really, really does. Because in chapter 11, we're going to be dealing with David and Bathsheba, which is one of the most, shall we say, take a person like David, who we're used to seeing as such a righteous man, not a perfect man. He has made mistakes, but in so much, as we said, seeking justice, seeking righteousness. And yet, when it comes to chapter 11, it really unravels. So let's start. Okay, the first verse of chapter 11 actually connects to the verse before it, to the chapter before it. We're still, in a sense, involved in these battles. We have the battles against Ammon and the battles against Aram. And now we say at the turn of the year, in other words, the following year, the season when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officer and all Israel with him, and they devastated Ammon and besieged Rabbah. Rabbah is the capital of Ammon, and David remained in Jerusalem. So here we see, in the way at the very end of chapter 10, we see, as I mentioned, that verse that he defeated the Arameans, but he still had the very end of this, and the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. Okay, so he solved the Aramean problem, but he still has the Ammonite problem. He has defeated Ammon in a number of battles, but we understand from the end of chapter 10 that Ammon remains a problem, and therefore there's a need for continued battle against Ammon. Okay, and so what we begin with in chapter 11, and it's interesting because the question, of course, begins, should the first verse of chapter 11, does that belong with chapter 10? Does that still belong with the continuation of the battle, or is it more relevant for the beginning of chapter 11? And I think it certainly is connected to chapter 10, but I think it's essential that it is at the beginning of chapter 11, because number one, we're going to see as the story progresses that the fact of an ongoing battle is very relevant to the story of David and Bathsheba. But if we also pay attention to this actually first verse, we learn something here that we did not see in any other battles. We talked at the beginning of the verse about the battles, besieged Rabbah. And then what do we have at the very end of the verse? David remained in Jerusalem. Now, there are some people who question that. And there's actually a debate about that. Is it justified for the king to remain in Jerusalem and send his armies out to fight? And there's really a debate about this, because many people say you don't want the king at all the battles, because the king needs to be safe. The king needs to be in a place where he is protected. So there's ongoing kingdom. The king is running the battle, but from afar, and he has to remain safe, so that he is ultimately the leader of the nation. On the other hand, there we saw before that David did go out to most of the battles. And we also saw that Saul before him went out to the battles. And in fact, Saul was killed in a battle against the Philistines. So there is certainly a tradition of the kings of Israel going out to battle themselves. On the other hand, it's very possible that there is a hint here of some level of criticism in the fact that while the soldiers and the army is battling at his behest, he remains in Jerusalem. Okay. So I would say that if we didn't have the story as it continues, this little part of a verse would not raise anybody's concern. You could still have this debate. Oh, should he have gone out to head the army or not? But of course, this becomes extremely relevant as we see how the story develops. So, verse 2. Late one afternoon, David rose from his couch and strolled on the roof of the royal palace. And here it's very interesting. The translation here is actually a very interesting translation. It says, and from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. Now, I will actually read to you the literal translation of this verse as it is written in Hebrew. David aroused from his couch, or you could say from where he was reclining, and he strolled on the roof of the house of the king, or of the royal palace. Until here, all good. And he saw a woman bathing from on top of the roof. Now, or on top of the roof. And the way on top of the roof is written, it can be translated as the woman was on top of a roof bathing, and that's how he saw her. Or it could be he saw her from on top of his roof. Okay? And of course, there's two, it says a great deal. If Abigail, not Abigail, Bathsheba, this we will learn as Bathsheba, but if Bathsheba is bathing on the rooftops where anybody can see her, that tells us something quite negative about Bathsheba. If, on the other hand, she's bathing in her house, and I don't know how many of you have ever gone up to the walls of Jerusalem and walk around the walls, and you also will see Jerusalem even today, and then for sure the houses had flat roofs. So Jerusalem is on a hill. So you can imagine if David's palace is higher up than most of the surrounding area. And actually, if you picture the city of David, okay, if any of you have gone there, first of all, if you're on the walls of the old city, of course, you can see down a lot of things. But even if you go to the city of David, which is slightly lower than the area of the Temple Mount, it's definitely going down. But from the area of where would have been the city of David, you look even further down into the valley below. And so it's and of course, I'm assuming that the Palace of David is a taller building than most, it's more elaborate, etc. So you can imagine David is strolling on his roof. He will have a view into people's homes that even if a woman is bathing, maybe she'd have pulled the curtains all the way or whatever, but it doesn't mean that she's doing something she shouldn't be doing. But again, this is one of those places where commentaries have divided on how do we actually interpret this verse. Okay, keep that in mind, because at the end of the story, one of the things we want to talk about is what was Bathsheba's role in all of this, okay? So here we go. And the king sent someone to make inquiries about the woman. Now notice he sent somebody. And we're going to see in the story quite a number of messengers. Every time the king sends a messenger, that means someone else knows what's going on. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. King sent someone to make inquiries about the woman. He reported she is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, and wife of Uriah the Hittite. So he looks at this woman, and one thing that's very, very important to, before we go into all the bad things that David did, one thing I do want to make very clear is that when David's going up on the rooftop, there's no indication that he is looking to, he's looking for a woman, okay? He's on his rooftop. He's taking a break. He's enjoying the night air, and he happens to see this woman, which is, of course, extremely relevant, okay? It's, you know, you can say a lot of bad things about David, but I don't think you could say he was looking for this kind of trouble. He got into trouble, but he wasn't looking for it, okay? Okay, so, but at this point, he's curious. She's beautiful. She catches his eye, and he makes inquiries, and his inquiries tell him she is a married woman, okay? Before anything happens, she knows very well that she's a married woman, and she knows who her husband is, and he is clearly, as we'll see later in the story, he is a major military figure in David's army. He knows who he is. He's you know, he knows exactly who he is. Now, before we go further, there are often questions when it says Uriah the Hittite. Now, we're familiar with the Hittite. We know what that word means. It usually means of the Hittite nation. And we've encountered Hittites along the way, starting back in Genesis, when Abraham is in the city of Hebron, and he wants to purchase the cave of Machpelah in order to bury his wife Sarah. He approaches the Hittites and ends up purchasing the cave in the field of Machpelah from the Hittites. So we know that there's this group of people called Hittites that are living in Hebron. Actually, though, the Hittites are quite a major empire at that time, and not necessarily at this time, but then, okay, and they're controlling basically the northeastern part of northeast of Israel, like the area of Turkey, Syria, at the time of Abraham, as part of the Hittite Empire. So you can ask, what are these Hittites, this other group of Hittites, doing all the way south in Hebron? It's definitely not part of their territory. And it could just be that a group of people who are originally Hittites, you know, move south and find a good place to live, and they settle in Hebron. But the main question we have here is this Uriah, is he an Israelite? If it says he's a Hittite, does it mean he's an Israelite? And it's certainly total consensus within Jewish commentators that he is indeed an Israelite. And there's a number of reasons for that. First and foremost, because there is, you know, the assumption is, I would say, that first of all, he is married to this woman who's clearly the daughter of a Jewish or Israelite person named Eliam, and he seems, the fact that usually a woman is, if she's a married woman, she is her name is given in conjunction with her husband, and she would only be given in conjunction with her father if she's not married. And here we have both the father and the husband mentioned, and so the assumption is the father was probably a well-known man, otherwise they wouldn't bother mentioning him. So a well-known man of an Israelite is not going to give his daughter to marry a Hittite. Also, look at his first name. His first name is Uriah. Uriah means light of God. Anytime you have the name Yah in a person's name, it's a dead giveaway that this person is an Israelite, because it's God's name. The Hebrew God's name is in that word. So there are a number of theories as to why he is called a Hittite. First of all, some people say, well, he was maybe from a Hittite family, but somewhere along the way, he or his ancestors converted into, or whatever the process was in those days, became an Israelite, accepted the God of Israel, and came and became part of the Israelites. Okay, There's also a theory that says that he's called a Hittite because in his military escapades, he encountered and had something to do, maybe defeated a Hittite. And we have a similar explanation that is given for this fellow Doeg, the Edomite, who you might recall was a fellow who made big trouble for David when he was fleeing from Saul. This is the fellow who happened to see David at the temple in Nov and was the one who actually then tells Saul that the priests of Nov have protected David, and as a result, Saul massacres all the priests of Nov, which is a terrible, terrible thing. But the fellow, the bad guy there is a guy named Doeg, the Edomite, and even then, I also explained that this is seen as an Israelite. And how do we explain that name? So there were three reasons. One is that he may come from a place called Edom or Adam, not Edom, Adam or Ademah. Both are Jewish or Israeli towns in the area of Benjamin. Another explanation, which I don't know if I mentioned then, but it is a similar explanation is given here, that also that fellow who was, we know he was, one of Saul's men, was involved in some kind of a battle against Edom. And a third explanation there is that he lived in an area of Edom. That's where he was living, an area that is or was part of Edom. And here too, we have a similar kind of possibility for the name Hittite, that he lived in an area where there were some Hittites. So if we will recall that there were some Hittites in Hebron, it's very possible that there remains some kind of an enclave of the Hittites or a place where Hittites used to live, centuries early, that was still called the Hittite neighborhood or whatever. And it's very possible that not even any Hittites there anymore, but it's called the Hittite neighborhood or Hittiteville or whatever. And that would be the reason for his name. So there are a lot of different possibilities as to why he's called a Hittite. But the important thing here is that there's a total consensus that he is an Israelite. He is not of the nation of Hittite. And that's very, very important. Okay, so let's continue now with the story. David, verse 4, David sent messengers to fetch her. She came to him, and he lay with her. She had just purified herself. Now, in my English translation, it says purified herself after her period. What it actually says is she purified herself after her period, after her state of impurity. Okay, and she went back home. So first of all, what does this mean? She purified herself. So just a review of the laws of purity that, by the way, are in place to this very day. Traditional Orthodox Jews do follow these rules, although they have slightly different ways of doing it today than they did then, but it's very similar. A woman who menstruates is impure for the period of her menstruation or for at least a week, okay? And after that, and during that time, she is not allowed to have relations with her husband. When that is over, when the period of her menstruation is over, she then purifies herself in a process of going into living waters. Now, I know there's a lot of churches that are called living waters. What does that mean? Okay, now in the Bible, it says literally living waters, Maim Chaim. And what that means is that it has to be, the waters themselves, their source has to be from something that flows. In others, it can be a river, okay? It could be a lake which gathers from the rain, okay? But it cannot be your bathtub, okay? So and those of you who may have toured Israel and seen what a mikvah, what a ritual bath looks like, there are today many, many ritual baths from the Second Temple period, which is, of course, a long time, more than 500 years after David's time, 600 years probably since David's time. But the principle would have been the same. The very fact that we don't see what the ritual baths looked like in the First Temple period, we can assume they look very similar to the ones in the Second Temple period. What are these? These are places, these are pools of sorts where either they're fed by a spring or they're fed by rainwater. And this is where women will actually go and immerse themselves to purify. Also, not just women. The priests would use it to purify. People going up to the temple, men and women would purify. So the fact that she was bathing in her home, the process of purification requires first to bathe and then to immerse into this ritual bath of some kind, which may be located near her house. There may be a place like that, or wherever. If she's in Jerusalem, this is the Gihon River is right there. She could have gone there into the spring. She could have gone there into a pool. So we don't have those details. But the fact that she is now, after being purified, connects very closely with the fact that she had been bathing. Okay, so chances are she's bathing to get ready for this immersion. And what that means is she is now ready and able to have sexual relations with her husband. Now, when a man and woman separates for this period of time, there is a great deal of excitement, expectation in this purification process, because what you are doing, the woman is getting herself ready to meet her husband. And keep that in mind when you now see what's happening next. So on the one hand, the fact that this is mentioned, people say, okay, this is to say, for all that David did, at least he didn't lay with a woman who was still menstruating. Okay, compared to committing adultery, it's not nearly as serious. But this also says something else, because if it's after this period of menstruation, and it's usually not right away after, but a bit more than that after, this would be at a time when she was very fertile. Okay, so that becomes very relevant here. Okay, so that's giving you a bit of context here. Now, also, let's pay attention to the verbs that are used here. Okay, David sent messengers, and here the translation is a little off. It says David sent messengers to fetch her, but actually the way it is written in the Hebrew is David sent messengers and he demanded the woman, or he sent for the woman. Okay, so we have David acting. He sent, he demanded, okay, and he's, going back, I'm in the wrong verse. Verse 4, I got mixed up. David sent messengers, he took her, all right, so in this case, he's doing both things. She came to him, she's doing something. He lay with her, okay? So we have 4 different verbs, 3 of which David does, 1 she does. So now the question becomes, when the verb that she does, she came to him, did she do that voluntarily? Okay, because one of the key issues here is, how do we see, again, her role in all of this? Clearly, David sees a woman that he knows is married, and he fetches her to have him brought to her. Okay, so why does it say she came to him? It could just be physically. He fought her and he said, come here. And so she goes to him. But it could also be that there was a willingness there in her. And this becomes very relevant. Was there effectively a rape here? Now, there's no question, not a rape in the physical sense, but when a man, and this is something actually today in laws having to do with rape, okay, there is a situation where a man who has authority over a woman, if he's her boss, if he's her commander in the army, if he's whatever, he's in a position of authority over the woman, even if he is not physically forcing himself on her, but he takes her and has relations with her, that will very often be considered rape, because her ability to say no is severely compromised when he has such authority over her. So there are many people who will therefore read this verse saying, no, she did not willingly go to him. She went in physically, but she had no choice. He was the king. He summoned her. He was the king. How much options do we have? And so here in this very verse, we can see in the way it's presented, we're going to have the question mark. He sent for her. Did she willingly go to him, or did she really effectively have no choice? And we can see it as a sort of rape situation. Okay, we will leave those questions in the air. Next, verse 5, the woman conceived, and she sent word to David, I am pregnant. Thereupon David sent a message to Joab, send Uriah the Hittite to me, and Joab sent Uriah to David. Okay, we got a problem here. She's pregnant, and her husband has been at the front all this time. And so here we have a situation where David, on the one hand, has clearly done a very bad thing. Okay, he's taken this woman, maybe by force or some level of force, but clearly, regardless of how she feels about it, he has lain with a married woman, which is totally wrong, totally forbidden. Okay, and she's pregnant, which means regardless of whether he would ever be blamed for this, and that's another question, does he see himself as, is he worried about what may come out about him? If you want to look positively at what David does here in some way, he is clear, there's no question, if she shows up pregnant and her husband has been away at the front all this time, she will be immediately blamed for adultery. And so at the very least, you can say here a word of something positive at David. He is looking out for her. He wants to protect her in some way. And then let's see what happens. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab and the troops were faring and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and bathe your feet. When Uriah left the royal palace, a present from the king followed him. And in other words, the king gave him a present, and some people say it would have been a meal of some sort, as a way of showing appreciation. Here is a man who's fighting in my army, doing important work. I'm not going to let him leave my palace empty-handed. So you have a picture here of somebody, not only the king, not only says, take a break, you deserve it, go home, go be with your wife, and here have a nice meal, take it home as well. When Uriah left the royal palace, a present from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the royal palace along with the other officers of his lord and did not go down to his house. So, in other words, what is David thinking? He wants Uriah to go, or Uriah, I'm not sure how you pronounce it in English. He wants him to go home, sleep with his wife, and therefore, when she shows up pregnant, in a few months, when it becomes obvious to everybody that she's pregnant, everybody will attribute to that visit that Uriah had with her. And then everybody's covered. Bathsheba is covered, and David is covered, and nobody needs to know. God knows it all, but at least nobody, in the people will know about it. But David now has a problem because Uriah didn't go home. He stayed with all the men at the entrance to the king's palace. When David was told that Uriah had not gone down to his house, he said to Uriah, you just came from a journey. Why don't you go down to your house? Uriah answered David, the ark in Israel and Judah are located at Sukkot. Now here, it's again, the translation has chosen a particular interpretation. Literally, it says here, the ark and Israel and Judah are sitting in Sukkot. Now, Sukkot can be translated as huts, as temporary dwellings. And this is the word in the Bible, in Exodus, that when we talk about the children of Israel left Israel, they in the desert, they dwelled in booths, in temporary structures. That becomes the reason for the holiday of the Feast of Tabernacles. And that word tabernacles is a very stupid word for what the Feast of Tabernacles is. Like a Sukkot doesn't mean a tabernacle. It means a booth. It means a temporary structure. Tabernacle is usually associated with the tabernacle, which is the temple of sorts in the desert. Although I understand that the reason it's called tabernacle, not a temple, because it's a temporary structure. But it's very confusing because when people hear tabernacle, they think, temple, and really, Sukkot just means any kind of temporary construction. However, there is indeed a place called Sukkot. So it could be that he's saying all these, the ark, Israel, and Judah are all in temporary dwellings, meaning they're camped out at the battlefield, or it can mean they're at Sukkot, which is been identified with a place that is on the way that the army of Israel would have had to travel in order to get to the battlefield with Ammon. Okay, so that could be read anyway. And he says, how can I go home? And then he goes on, though, and says, and my master Joab and your majesty's men are camped in the open. So even if you don't interpret they're in Sukkot as also camped in dwellings, and here he says it very clearly. They're camped. They're in the middle of a war. They're in tents. They're on the ground. They're in the open. Okay. How can I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live by your very life, I will not do this. Okay. So here we see the relevance of that few words at the end of verse 1. And David is dwelling in Jerusalem. David is not with his troops. David is in Jerusalem. Now, you can justify his being in Jerusalem, but can you justify him not being in a situation where his complete attention is on the battle? He's sitting there in the war room. He has the maps drawn in front of him. He's getting generals and messengers coming from the front all the time, and all he's doing is thinking about the war. And of course, that's not what happens. He goes up and he was lying down for a bit. Then he goes up and he's on the rooftop and he's getting the night air. And that's when he sees Bathsheba. That's when he gets into trouble. And here you have this amazing contrast between Uriah, who is saying, I am not going to give myself pleasure and comfort when my people are in the battlefront. And how that contrasts with David, while his people who he has led, who he has sent into battle, while they're in that situation, and he takes the time to stroll on the rooftop and look at a woman, and not just look at a woman, but send to her and lie with her. And I will just, we'll stop here and see what happens next. But okay, let's continue the next two verses because it's continuing the same idea. David said to Uriah, stay here today also, and tomorrow I will send you off. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. The next day, David summoned him, and he ate and drank with him until he got him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went to sleep in the same place with his Lord's officers. He did not go down to his home. So in other words, David keeps trying to find ways he gets him drunk. He thinks that'll do the answer. Maybe they'll go home and sleep it off. At least people will see him going home. And but Uriah doesn't. He stays put. Now, I want to just raise another possibility. The way Uriah talks is incredibly noble, with a great, great contrast to David. On the other hand, there are those who've seen a bit of something else in Uriah's behavior. Remember all the messengers. David sent a messenger to find out who is Bathsheba. David sends a messenger to send for Uriah, and sends a messenger to bring Bathsheba to him. And if you picture the entrance to the palace with all these men, all these very servants of David and messengers, etc., are hanging out there, and this is where Uriah is sleeping. He has just spent 2 days with people who have seen a lot of suspicious goings on between David and Bathsheba. So one theory is maybe after the first night with these people, he already heard rumors about what is happening. And maybe that's why he didn't go back. And it's possible, okay, that when he says to him, how can I do this? There's a bit of criticism that he is leveling at David. Of course, very, very in a hint, not overtly. He is the king after all, as if to say, some of us have been very busy fighting while others of us have found the time to do other things. Okay. Now, again, I think the text is open to a number of these different interpretations. Okay. But I'm just presenting them to you. So we will stop here after verse 13, and we will continue. This is a story that goes on and it continues and has great significance for us, of course. So I think we'll be doing it at least next week and maybe even after that as well. Yeah, definitely after that, because we still have, whatever, lots more to deal with. Anyway, that's it for today. Any comments or questions? Okay. Yes, Carol?
Yeah, well, I think it would show a great deal of deviousness to do what you suggest, but not impossible. But in that case, it shows a great deal of naivety to sort of indirectly threaten the king, and he's going off back to battle. So I don't know.
No, I agree. I'm not sure it is the preferred. I personally do not subscribe to that interpretation. I do believe that scripture is trying to paint Uriah as a really righteous man and contrasting him with David and keeping him naive of the whole thing. But I did read this other interpretation, and it is something that is legitimate. It's a legitimate interpretation, so I'm sharing that. Yes, there's somebody here called Heartland with his hand raised. I don't see your name. Do you want to say something? No. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Well, it was good to see you all, and hopefully see you again next week. Same time, same channel. Bye-bye.